Hello, welcome. Welcome to Beyond Standardized Testing, Can We Measure What Matters? My name is Fiona, and I'm going to facilitate this session. So I'm going to introduce the speakers, and then there will be time for questions and answers after the speakers. Each speaker is going to talk for about 10 minutes. So, biographies. We're going to start with Ruth Childs. Ruth is an associate professor in the Department of Leadership, Higher and Adult Education at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, University of Toronto, and a past president of the Canadian Educational Researchers Association. She teaches courses in research design and measurement theory and has conducted many studies investigating the design and equity of large-scale assessments, admissions processes, and other evaluation systems. Her most recent large research projects investigated how elementary school students deal with uncertainty when answering multiple choice questions. I think it's really cool. And what Ontario universities are going to do to improve access for underrepresented groups. Then we will turn to Santiago Rincon Gallardo. I was very nervous about that. Is a Banting postdoctoral fellow at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education and the chief research officer at Michael Fullan's international consulting team. In this position, Santiago conducts research and advises system leaders and educators to advance whole system reform of instructional improvement. Santiago worked for over a decade promoting grassroots educational change initiatives in Mexican public schools serving historically marginalized communities. His academic work explores how effective pedagogies for deep learning can spread at scale. Santiago holds an Ed.M. in International Education Policy and an Ed.D. on Education Policy, Leadership, and Instructional Practice from Harvard. Last, we will have Sue Winton, who is an Associate Dean of Research and Community in the Faculty of Education at York University. Her research examines policy influences, practices, and implications for critical democracy. In a current project, Dr. Winton is investigating how social and historical contexts influence policy advocacy efforts and outcomes. In a second project, Dr. Winton and colleagues from the University of Ontario Institute of Technology and Western University are investigating the complexities of policy enactment in Ontario secondary schools. This research aims to shed new light on how policy is interpreted, prioritized, and done in real-world contexts. Thank you very much to the speakers. Over to you.
I have to admit, having a hard time figuring out where to begin with this topic. It's so huge, and I know any of us could probably talk for hours about it. And I don't have hours. I have well, now 1.5 minutes. So I thought I would start by actually talking about standardized testing and what we even mean when we talk about standardized testing and what kind of comes within that. Because I know one of the challenges in the measuring what matters discussions and any other talks about large-scale testing are so often we use the same terms, but we may be assuming that we're talking about more or less rigid things. So I'm going to try to kind of stretch maybe what we're talking about here. Oops. Okay. And I'll figure this out here. Okay, so that's a student. That was the best I could do. It's a little triangle or a little rectangle with a head on it. So you'll be seeing lots of those. But if you have just one student and you want to try to understand what they know, what they can do, whether that's reading, writing, math, or creativity or citizenship, like Alan was talking to us this morning, thinking about figuring that out for one student is something that probably all of us could come up with some ideas, right? We could come up with some tasks. We could sit with the kid. We could try to have them explain their reasoning. We could spend some time and try to understand that child. Even if we're not an expert in assessment, even if we're not a teacher, we would have some sense of maybe where we would begin with one kid. Now, when you are starting to think about more kids, I mean, obviously to assess a whole classroom, teachers spend a lot of time developing the skills to be able to do that. And if you're going to go beyond one classroom, it gets more complicated because the sort of intuitive things that we might do and the kind of like making it up as we go along isn't going to work if we've got to scale it up. So the idea with standardized testing was always, what do we have to standardize in order to scale it up? What can we do? What are the trade-offs? So we can test all of the individual students. When we scaled it up, usually the thing that happens is you have quite a simple set of tasks, usually paper and pencil, something that can be administered the same way by a whole bunch of people following simple instructions, and can be marked in the same way by a whole bunch of people following simple instructions. Multiple choice is really great with that. You can actually have a machine scan it. That's the easiest way to scale, right? We just have standardized things. I'm sure we're going to talk later about what we might lose in the process of that. Once we've administered something like that to all the little individual students, we can aggregate it up to the province level, right? And we can get some provincial level results, and we can say what the kid, how well the kid is doing, but we could also say, on the provincial level, 75% of our students are doing whatever. We could also, once we've got all those little individual test results, we could do districts. This is not 70 districts, but we could do district school boards, right, and say the school board is doing this well, and so forth. We could actually go finer than that to schools. Again, we've got all of these individual students. We can report out at the school level. We could even, in some cases, report out at the classroom level. And that's what we've been seeing in Ontario for the past 15, well, more than 15 now years, is that very, very simple model, right, where we've just standardized, simplified things. We've scaled it up. We can do it the same everywhere, and we get results for the kids, and we put them all together, and we get the province and all the other levels. So one test, all the kids, and we get results at all of the levels. So that often in Ontario is what we talk about when we talk about standardized testing. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the other things that we might do. And I have to say, I've been for years talking to EQAO about this as well, and so have many other people, including some of the teachers' unions, too. But here's one possibility. You could not test every child, right? You could test half the kids. You could test a third of the kids. If you do that, you can get the provincial results, no problem, right? You don't need every kid to get province-level results. That's almost 140,000 kids at a grade level, right? You do not need 140,000 kids at a grade level to get provincial results. You can get board results. You probably can't get school results because you probably picked those kids a school at a time, so you're not disrupting every school in the province. So you're not going to get school-level results. So one test, a sample of students in schools, and we can get provincial level and board level results. And again, I'm hoping we're going to talk about this later with policy implications and so forth. I think that's not a bad trade-off. Here's another possibility. We could have multiple forms of a test, shorter ones. We could divide a test up in halves, thirds, quarters, whatever, and we could give different kids different pieces of it. And then, again, no problem at the province, no problem for the board. We can probably, for the larger schools, get results. A lot less pressure on the kids. A lot less pressure on the teachers. A lot less expensive. Here's another possibility. We could test every child, but only send some of the papers in centrally. So this is a model that some other jurisdictions have tried, where you have teachers contribute to putting together a standardized test, you share it across the province, you have it administered, teachers mark it, and then teachers send back a sample of the papers centrally, and you get immediate results at the classroom, not 6 months later. The teacher has that to use immediately to complement what she's already doing in the classroom, and the province can take that sample of things that were sent in and get provincial and board results, and the student classroom and school is all there immediately, locally. And one of the things you can do here is if you're worried that some of the teachers may be marking a little bit easier or harder, and that's really, really important to you, you can also, once you mark that sample of papers centrally, you can send back some feedback and say, hey, here's what we saw when we marked these. Check what you found, and just use that to inform your own interpretation of your results, right? Nothing back to us, but here's just, to inform your interpretation. And of course, there's lots of other combinations. You could have multiple short tests and only give them to a sample of students. In schools, for example, you could have, once you start cutting down, right, we could have, for the same money that we spend now, richer items and tasks, right? If you're not having to administer exactly the same thing at every school, you could have kids doing some really hands-on things. In fact, there was some stuff piloted in the early days by EQAO, some richer math tasks, and some of you will remember other kinds of richer tasks. So richer items and tasks. We could go beyond reading, writing, and math to some of these other things, citizenship, creativity. Those aren't add-ons. Those are really, really important. If we don't have, without increasing the resources, we could allocate our resources differently. And even more teacher marking than what I've just described here would also be possible. And there's lots of other possibilities that we could talk about as well. But that is. I have to say thank you. I have wanted to find somebody who was interested in talking about matrix test design. So thanks for letting me do that.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for being here. I'm Santiago Rincon Gallardo. As Fiona was saying, I'm the Chief Research Officer for Michael Fullan's consulting team. And we have currently been involved in several projects, one of which is called New Pedagogies for Deep Learning. And what we're trying to do is work with clusters of schools, clusters of about 100 schools in different countries, to develop what we call the new pedagogies on the ground, to start defining with some precision what deep learning looks like, and designing the pedagogies that can create those kind of can support deep learning among students, and finding out what school conditions and what system conditions can be put in place to support new pedagogies for deep learning. We're doing this right now in 7 countries, about 600 schools, and we're hoping to move forward to 3 more countries to get to the 1,000 schools. I have only been involved also in some efforts in Latin America, especially in Colombia and in Mexico, to bring powerful pedagogy to scale across entire educational systems. So in the case of Mexico, bringing a powerful model of learning communities to about 9,000 schools across the country. In the case of Colombia, an alternative model for rural schools that spread across 20,000 schools across the country in the 70s, 80s, etc. So let me just say up front, I have 2 biases here in my presentation. I want to be very clear about 2 biases. The first one is our first bias is we're action-oriented. So that's our stance. We think we understand reality better when we try to change it than by taking distance and observing it from the distance. So what our approach is, we build theory from good practice, and not the other way around. So that's our approach to systems change. That's how we interact with the educational systems, and that's our pretty much epistemological stance. That's how we go about building knowledge. Our second bias is a whole system bias. We're trying always to develop whole system solutions, and by that I refer to solutions for entire districts, for entire provinces, for entire states. We have recently been engaged in trying to help develop or trying to start to explore how to develop new measures for deep learning, measures for school conditions that allow for deep learning to flourish, and measures for entire systems conditions that allow and support and sustain and spread deep learning and new pedagogies. And we have also been interacting with the OECD. There's currently a project that is aimed at developing measures of critical thinking and creativity skills. And while they're providing kind of the technical support, we're trying to build the practices on the ground. So we're interacting with them as well, and that's part of our interest in the work that People for Education is leading. The first thing I wanted to do is very quickly answer to the question that's guiding this panel, which is, can we measure what matters? So the short presentation for me in this case would be a resounding yes, and it would be it would follow by and we should. And the reason why we should is because the more precise we get about what quality looks like in the new schools we want to build, the better we're going to be at supporting the development of the kind of skills and results that we want to create. Now, that being said, I think that the work of developing the measures, which will take a lot of intellectual effort, a lot of time, a lot of thinking, a lot of negotiation, reaching agreements, etc., is in a way the easy part. That's going to be the easy part. And I know it's very challenging. It will take a lot of time. It will be very taxing for all of us. But in my view, the crucial question is, what are they going to be used for? And how are they going to be used that will make the difference between the new measures we develop being drivers for the kind of changes that we want to see in schools and in society, or them becoming the cause of fragmentation and new bureaucracy, dysfunctionality, etc. So we will need to be very careful about what we're using the measures for and how we're using them. And what I want to present here are 4 ideas that we're developing that are evolving, but for which I would love to, ideas that I want to bounce off with you to see whether or not they resonate. We're developing I'm presenting these ideas as a result of the initial interactions we're having with the people developing new practices and trying to work with new measures on the ground. 4 basic principles. First principle, I will list them and then I will talk briefly about each of them. Visible learning drives school and system change. Principle number 2, radically transforming everyday practice is our point of departure and our destination. 3, cycles of inquiry are the vehicle to change classroom practice, school conditions, and the larger system. 4th principle, measures are not used to be prescriptive, they're used to be precise. They're not to be prescriptive, we're developing them to be more precise. And I will talk more briefly about each of these principles. When we see the systems working on the new pedagogies, doing the new pedagogies work, especially here in Ontario, one thing that many teachers and students and administrators are telling us is that what's driving the work of the teachers and what's driving teachers to do more work and putting more time into changing their pedagogy is seeing the learning in the students, seeing it, observing it, seeing how kids are more excited about learning, how they're asking more sophisticated questions, how they're articulating what they're doing and why, how they're bringing the questions to their homes and exploring with their parents, etc. Administrators are getting attracted to the work because they're seeing the learning of the students. So what's driving the movement that we see growing in many of the clusters we're working with is the visibility of the learning. It is not the rise, the increases in standardized testing. And that's a shift in how we have seen the province working. The province, a lot of the effort has been on looking at standardized testing results, trying to focus on very focused actions to increase it, but that's reaching a limit. And it's getting to a point where now lots of the practices are more about getting the students who are close to the standard and to the provincial standard and try to move them. rather than changing substantially pedagogy. So we can see schools that are high performing, yet the practices that we're seeing, we don't see the lively kind of learning that we want to see for kids to thrive, and that we need to see in classrooms as a demonstration of kids thriving in the world. These are just the 6 C's that we have adopted just to use to think about what are markers of what are the key areas for deep learning. So the 6 C's are character, education, citizenship, communication, critical thinking, and problem solving, collaboration, creativity, and imagination. So what's driving school and system changes that we're seeing happening is the visibility of these skills in students' everyday activity. Second, radically transforming everyday practice is our point of departure and our destination. The kids we're working with are starting to work from day one on pretty complex problems. We have kids trying to identify, for example, a subway station, how they can redesign the subway station so that it's accessible for wheelchairs and strollers. And they create the maps, they create the models, they come out with alternative solutions, they analyze the dilemmas, and then they make decisions and present a proposal to TTC, for example. We see students trying to, in Uruguay, for example, students developing a cell phone that is made out of recycled materials and that leaves a much lower carbon print than conventional cell phones, etc. What we see them doing is engaging from day one in really powerful work. So that shifts the conversation around schooling. Schooling has been, in many instances, a preparation for the future. It's something that delays the activity of the students as real life citizens. And what we do is to bring to the practice of the present the kind of expected behaviors we would like to see in the future. So that's the second principle. Cycles of collaborative inquiry are the vehicle to change classroom practice, school conditions, and the larger system. This is one thing that Ontario has very good practice on. I think the cycles of collaborative inquiry are very much embedded in the practice of schools. So it's a matter of finding the evidence of what we're achieving, what practices may be leading to the results we have, how can we make changes, how we try, what can we do differently, try out, change our practices, and assess them, try them out, assess them, etc. But what we're suggesting here is that the cycles of inquiry need to happen also at the system level. So as schools, the system, need to also be looking at evidence in terms of what's happening in schools, what kind of supports are we providing, what kind of supports we still need to provide, what's not working or what we're trying to do, and how do we change our approach also to support the schools. So cycles of inquiry as the basic practice and a vehicle to change not only classroom practice in schools, school conditions, but system conditions as well. And finally, new measures are not used to be prescriptive, but to be precise. What we have been doing with the new pedagogies is to develop some rubrics that allow teachers, students, parents to observe, to see what collaboration looks like at different levels of sophistication. So these kind of rubrics offer some really precise visions of what the skill looks like in practice. And teachers can look across the continuum and then see where they are at and what they can do next, what are areas that can deepen their practice, and we have that for each of the 6 Cs. But we're also creating some rubrics to understand the sequence of learning tasks, what kind of tasks we can design that are more or less sophisticated than others. So we have also the progressive nature of the rubric, school conditions and system conditions as well. So again, these are rubrics right now that are not being used to be prescriptive, to dictate what needs to be done, but to develop some clarity amongst practitioners, amongst policymakers, amongst school leaders of what the kind of things we create look like in practice, and allow also have a developmental framework to it so that people can know where they are and where they can move next. Okay, so I will leave it here, and then we can discuss more. Thank you very much.
So thank you, everybody. as I was introduced, I'm Sue Winton from York University. And when I was asked to speak on this panel, I was thinking, like Ruth, how am I going to even take this on? What am I going to try to get to? So I actually we were sent some guiding questions that you could consider in your presentation, so I decided to follow that. And one of the questions was, how would you describe Ontario's current reporting and accountability process for student achievement? So I decided to really focus on the words reporting and accountability, and less so about measurement. So in particular, I'm not going to talk about report cards and the teacher and student interviews, so the kind of reporting that happens at the local level. At least I'm not going to talk about that yet. I might get there. I am going to get there. But I'd say that in terms of the current reporting, primarily through EQAO tests at the provincial level or for the international test results like PISA, I think what they try to tell us is that in the case of PISA or other international tests, how Canadian students perform on those tests compared to how other people from other places perform on those tests. I think they're used for lots of other reasons to represent and stand in for a lot of other things, but I think that's really what they tell us. And also with EQAO testing, they tell us kind of how your school or your student or your board, depending on what information you get, performed relative to a standard that's constantly changing and to others in other places. And I think they also tell us that a student's socioeconomic status really has a lot to do with the test performance. And in terms of who are they reported to and for what purposes, and are under the idea of accountability oftentimes, I think large-scale test scores are reported to the taxpayer, right? That's one kind of audience to indicate value for money, the impact of investments, a rationale for policy reform. And because, of course, the link to the economy, which is how a lot of these test scores stand in for, that they're supposed to tell the taxpayer an indicator of Ontario's relative position in the global economy, like how well are our students able to compete. I think that they're reported sometimes to the voter to indicate the success or the failure of particular government actions. They're reported to the house buyer as a selling feature of a particular neighborhood, perhaps. They're reported to parents as a collective in a particular school to demonstrate how well their school is doing relative to other schools, or perhaps that's how it's taken up. Maybe that's not always the intention, but that's certainly sometimes how it's taken up in my experience also as a parent. And they're also sometimes reported to individual parents about their own child's achievement. And I am all of those people. I'm a taxpayer, a voter, a parent, a house buyer. But I'm also a citizen who values public education for its potentials to strengthen democracy and democratic citizenship. And there's nothing in those reports from EQAO or the international tests that speak to those priorities that are important to me as a citizen. They don't tell me who can wrestle over difficult ideas with other people, as Alan Sears was talking about this morning as a key element of citizenship. I can't get any of those out of the current tests. So thinking about sort of what are some of the benefits of the current reporting and accountability efforts, I would say that for me, the biggest benefit absolutely are really regular and predictable public dialogues about assessment in education and whether or not we should be doing it. So this kind of conversation that seems to be coming up every year, I think is really important and I think that these tests open the door for those dialogues. Sometimes if we're lucky, we even talk about, what are the real purposes of education and what should the goals be, what should the priorities be. In terms of the limitations there's lots of written about limitations of standardized tests, which I know many people probably already know in this room. And any of the ones I'm about to mention are not ones that I've discovered on my own, but rather that I'm trying to pull from a lot of different places. But what we've seen about when there's testing, there's lots of evidence to show that first of all, in terms of what counts as literacy and numeracy becomes narrowed, so that can be tested. There's narrowing of curriculum priorities. We see there's more time on a narrower range of what counts as particular kinds of knowledge and less time on non-tested subject areas. So, of course, this leads to a reduction in what the value of other subjects and constructs some things as more important and less important. We see in some places teaching to the test. And so we see all this. So we see that there's increased emphasis on the acquisition of information and skills at the expense of asking critical questions and the consideration of controversial topics. Because of course we can't do it all. There's lots to do. Their choices are made, and this is some of the outcomes of choice of testing. There's issues, of course, related to funding. There are sometimes limits on how funds can be spent by schools in terms of professional development and other kinds of materials. There's limits on kind of school goals. I did some research in a school once where they were like, hey, for your school improvement plan, be collaborative. And the principal brought everyone together, and the school said, okay, we've decided we want it to be about character. And the school board said, no, it has to be like literacy or numeracy related. So there was some narrowing there. Also, then again, so we see the money that could be spent on testing, of course, that is spent on testing could be spent on other priorities. There's lots written around how testing can deprofessionalize and de-skill teachers. As I mentioned, there's limitations sometimes on the topics that are available for professional development. Certain days are given particular priorities. In some cases, in some schools, there's been direct government interventions in classrooms that didn't exist before. As I mentioned, I think because of the way that some large tests are used in terms of particularly around housing, this is a good school because it has good test scores. I think this has helped to serve to perpetuate class differences and inequities in schools. We know that schools with good scores are located in more affluent communities for lots of reasons that have lots to do with with the affluence, let's put it that way. And of course, these schools then, they start to fundraise more, and there's more opportunities, and it kind of just keeps going and going. And as I mentioned before, the connection between test scores and used as a proxy for Canada's role in the global economy, as an indicator of human resources, it really helps to narrow what counts as the purpose of public education. So I think that that's what's reported and for what purposes and some benefits and some limitations. So a goal for this session, as I was told, was to consider possibilities that support intelligent accountability. So that's where I kind of want to get to now. And so I'm going to propose maybe like a radical alternative to standardized testing or to our current system of accountability and reporting. This is one that would engage citizens in regular dialogues about the purposes of education, collaborative goal setting, dialogues about various strategies for achieving diverse purposes, and an ongoing revisiting of practices and priorities. In short, this is to enact the democracy that was described by Alan Sears this morning, that we say we want to enable our own children as citizens to do in schools and as graduates. I'd like to see this happening in schools and in communities as a model for reporting and accountability. So what would be reported would be tied to the purposes and goals of public education. Now, I know there's always multiple, and they're always competing, and they have been for a long time, and I'm sure they'll continue to be so. But what they need to be continually debated. People need to recognize that there's diverse schools. I had a very interesting conversation with someone at the university the other day, and he said, well, of course, people go to university to get jobs. And I was like, well, actually, a lot of people don't do that. And I could see, he was sort of surprised. I think I was the first person to say that maybe people would go to university for another reason other than that. But the point is, it's good that we had that conversation, that we could see there's different points of view out there. So there's a question about whether we should just measure more and different things. And I would say, I'm wary about saying, instead of measuring 2 things, let's instead measure 6 or 8. Because I still think we run the risk of, if these 6 things are in, then the rest of the things are out, kind of thing. And so I think there's a risk of narrowing in the same way that we've seen with other priorities. And furthermore, I think we know that it's sort of a one-size-fits-all standard is... how does that, we want schools and teachers and educators and parents to be able to respond to the needs as they emerge, that I think when there's sort of standardized bodies of knowledge, that makes it harder to do that. So how would the reporting happen? So I imagine that, at the beginning of a school year, a community, so not just the people who have kids in the school, but people who live in the community could participate in dialogues at the local level. Ongoing regular dialogues. Okay, what's going to be our priority this year? Maybe it's socio-emotional learning. Maybe it's citizenship. We can't do it all. Maybe we should just pick some focal areas. Okay, what is success going to look like? How are we going to know if we're making any changes in these particular areas? What might be some indications? What might student work might look like? What might dialogues in the hall look like? What might the relationships look like? It could be anything, and it wouldn't have to be the same from this school A to school B to school C. And then in terms of accountability and reporting, well, that would happen through continued dialogues. Okay, so what happened this year? What did you do? What were some of the influences? What were the outcomes? What should we do next? So the accountability is at the community level amongst and between the teachers, the parents, the community members, and the students. So the responsibility and the accountability would be shared and required by all the participants and all the citizens, all the participants as citizens in a democracy. So finally, I think what might be some potential outcomes and effects of such a model? I think that we might see that educators can focus on these particular problem areas that have been selected collectively without the fear that students won't perform well enough on tests, so that might guide them to sort of maybe decrease risk-taking or expand it, and this way they can expand what they cover, and would enable teachers to perhaps be more responsive to student community needs. I think that students, teachers, and community members who, through the engagement, would come to value a greater range of issues, topics, and et cetera. Individuals, they would learn about these diverse perspectives and experiences that would offer counter-narratives to sort of the dominant policy truths that go around and circulate in conversations. And finally, as schools and communities address a broader and ever-changing range of priorities and purposes in education, they would, in so doing, be living and enhancing democracy. Thanks.
Okay, so questions for panelists? Yes.
I have a question about QAOs. As it stands right now, if the school performs very poorly on whether it be the math or the literacy QAO, is there a system in place that school therefore gets some kind of support, and what does that support look like?
There's the focus, the OISE, I think it was called the Very Focused Intervention Program, and it has shown some success. I think it has brought down the number of schools that were kind of consistently underperforming to a couple digits, from hundreds of them to about 20 or so. And what the ministry offers is intensive support for schools in the form of coaching, in the form of and what they do is to develop collaboratively with the school a strategy to deal with the shortcomings. So there's some pressure there because there's an expectation that the schools will do better, but there's also a lot of support offered on site with the schools for teachers to get better at their practice in that narrow range of literacy and numeracy. But there are those resources available.
And are students informed of their results, or is it strictly board-wise? Every student is given their own results?
Yeah, parents get the results, but it's many, many months after that. That thing. Yeah.
Do you want to add to that?
No, one time I did some research in a school. I had been, it was part of the OFIP program, and they were like, we've been OFIP'd. Like it kind of became a verb, right? That they felt that it wasn't all negative, and I don't want to suggest that it was all negative, but there was a related outcome was that there was increased government sort of involvement directly into the classroom level, which was a very unusual experience in Ontario. I will say that in other jurisdictions, in other countries, sometimes schools have been very strategic in how they've used extra funds and so on that's supposed to target these problem areas, and they've used them in very creative ways, and that may also have been the case in some of the Ontario schools.
So a program like that, is that just teaching to the like a much larger scale? Like, are they going in and trying to increase scores, or is it more like just general development?
At least what you would say in the reported practice, it is more about the provincial standard is pretty high. I mean, for kids to be able to read at level B in mathematics to get to level B in both literacy and numeracy, they need to have very sophisticated reading, writing, communicating skills, and also very, very sophisticated mathematical thinking as well. So the focus of the provincial support, as far as I understand, is way more on changing your teaching practice. That being said, the practice of teaching to the test, I think, is happening in several schools, especially up to a certain point where you cannot, I mean, when just changing the pedagogy or doing some adaptations to pedagogy do not yield more results. So there's this more undesirable practice of teaching to the test. I've heard of some name they give to the students that are a few decimal points below the standards, and they work in a focused way with them so that they will increase the and that's the dark side of standardized testing, of course.
Yes, and then.
I was an educator in a school, in an OFIP school, and the support we received was great for our professional practice. So that's just my experience in that school, but we really learned a lot about the student. It was very student-focused, and so we learned a lot about our students, and through that, I graduated.
Can I just add a comment about this OFIP? So I'm Rachel Barrison. I work for the Ministry of Education, and OFIP schools, like Sue suggested, she spoke of affluent schools and schools in challenging circumstances. OFIP schools tend to have be in communities with tremendous challenges and poverty, and often see some of the most innovative, some of the most amazing pedagogy and teaching actually happening in those schools, and tremendous evidence of learning. I think the purpose of the OFIP intervention is essentially to do what Sue's model or suggestion is to actually engage in a school-wide process. What we haven't seen is community engagement in that, but I think that is definitely the next step.
Is there a way of identifying what the perhaps learning disability or problem that the child has with these tests, and are they getting the help they need? And aren't they removing special ed funding and having less people in funding from special ed? So isn't there kind of a mismatch in what they're saying and doing?
Who wants to take that one?
As far as I knew, in my school, there really wasn't much help for them. We weren't identified. We didn't even have one special ed person here.
I don't know, so I'm not going to answer it because I don't know. That's my answer. I don't know.
I mean, I certainly, I guess I'm torn, and you could probably tell between, how important is it for us to have these standardized results for the individual child, because no, the EQAO tests have no diagnostic value for special needs, right? That's an entirely separate process. So I guess one of the things that I'm hoping we'll get to, and so maybe I'll just go there, is in order for the students to get to the knowledge and skills and citizenship, of whatever type, they have to have some opportunities, right? And in situations where we don't have confidence that there are those opportunities, focusing all of our assessment on what the kids know and then trying to figure out what's up with the kid seems to me a bit premature. And I think about when I think about opportunity to learn, I think about things like the surveys of which of our schools still have libraries. That's a really dramatic example where we could really argue that before we go spending a bunch of money seeing how our kids are doing in reading, each individual student, maybe we could look and see what kinds of opportunities and supports are already in place. And I guess I've especially been thinking about that, if we are going to open the conversation, really push the conversation beyond reading, writing, and math, creativity, we probably all have some concerns about really realistically what kinds of opportunities are there. Are there ways we can think about systematically getting some data and some conversations, and maybe this is where a lot of the community input comes in, those kinds of conversations about the opportunities as kind of a first step.
Wow, okay, lots of hands just went up. Okay, you, and then you, and then you.
It's very short, just about engaging the community. I've often found any parent council I go to, I've been on parent council in my child's daycare, I'm an ECE myself. How many people in here are parents that have come just as a parent that are not connected to the education system at all?
No.
I applaud you, because everywhere I go, it's parents that are educators. And they're the only ones that are willing to come from the community, that are at our parent council meeting. We want people, you want everyone to be part of that conversation. They're either not interested, they don't think it matters, they, whatever it is. I don't know if you're expecting.
I think, can I just say something about that, with parent councils in particular, I was in a conversation about that earlier. I think, and I can't speak to your case, but generally speaking, like I think about our schools council, like it is not a place for democratic dialogue. I'll tell you that right now. It is like that has like some key. There's many dedicated people. I don't want to minimize that, but it's not a place where there's dialogue and exchange about like important issues that pertain. It is has a very particular function, and I've sort of asked that question, like could school councils be more than that? Could it be something else? Could it be a place of an education space for people who are connected to the school in whatever way they choose to be? But I think, so for myself, as much as I'm looking for, I'm highly engaged in education, like you said, in terms of my work and my interests. But I'm not engaged in our school council at all.
Well,
because it doesn't
almost make a news council about this stuff.
Well, someone said, why don't you create like a political committee, like a subcommittee? And I thought, well, okay, I could do that, and who knows, maybe I will, because the more I go talk to people are interested. I said one time to my principal, like, what if we like showed a movie around consumerism in schools? And she said, well, it might be a little controversial. And I said, well, I show my classes all the time. She's like, oh, I don't really think so. And I'm like, well, it could be like a school council initiated, like, let's talk about consumerism. But some people, but if not, the school council, and part of me goes, it doesn't have to be the school council. But part of me says, but the school councils are there in a lot of places already, so I'm not, maybe it's space.
Yeah, I just find that pulling that community in can sometimes be
difficult. Okay, sorry.
I just want to make a comment to that, so my name is Tracy. I'm the chair of the Ottawa Common Assembly of School Councils, and OPES, so it's an independent group, umbrella group of all of the school councils in the Ottawa Common District School Board, and we meet together to address and talk about and help support councils in our area to do these exact things, to actually fulfill the intended purpose of councils, which is not what many of us think, and in fact is really spelled out clearly in the legislation around student achievement and accountability in schools. If anyone has questions at all about our experience and how we've transformed, or how my experience in changing or helping to influence, or I don't know what the word is, your councils to be more engaged and involved in these conversations, you can email me at chair@ocas.ca. But I guess just don't lose hope for those of you who haven't had that experience. There's many, many, many school councils in Ontario and outside of Ontario that absolutely are having this kind of conversation that have been really successful.
Just as a guiding principle, I think we are, of course, expecting a lot from schools, again, as we usually do, and I think we should. But at the same time, the principle I wanted to bring here is, if we want our kids to care about nature, to be good citizens, to be effective communicators and collaborators, etc., the best thing we can do as adults for them, teachers, parents, school councils, etc., is to model those practices. If we make those spaces places where we're practicing what we want to see in the kids, the rate at which we're going to accelerate and deepen the learning of the students is going to be very quick. But I think that's an important principle to keep in mind. It's not only about what the teachers will do in the classroom with the kids, it's what adults surrounding the kids' lives are doing, and I think it's very important to shape that.
Thanks. Kelly.
I wanted to go back to Ruth's comment about opportunity to learn and potentially broadening the way we think about what we're measuring, what schools are doing to not only include students' intellectual development, but their social emotional development and their development as healthy people. And certainly broader child development frame. One of the things in my research has been looking at how child welfare in schools talk to each other or don't. And it's very clear when you talk to a bunch of social workers that the truism about school as a black box is completely true outside the world of education. They don't know anything much about what makes a difference for students in terms of opportunities. And I think it's really critical that we get better at articulating what it is that really helps kids learn, kids facing disadvantage in some cases, what really helps kids be social emotionally stronger. And schools do all that work already, and they do a lot about it, but they cannot tell that story very well using the measures we're using, which are output measures of two intellectual areas of growth. And so I do think we really need, when you talk to child welfare workers and they're like, well, we hope one day we'll get their marks. That would be really great that we'd know everything about school. They know. We've got to do a better job on the education side of picking, actually prioritizing and picking a few things that we measure that help us know whether schools do a good job helping children develop, not just brains on it.
Thank you. Yeah.
So 2 parts to my question. The first one is just a confirmation. Is this more than just refinement of the process and procedure? Are we looking at fundamental change in how we measure what the purpose of school is? And the second part is we have so many different stakeholders, and you mentioned systems thinking. There's so many different people involved, students to teachers, to parents, to ministry, to policymakers at different levels. Where do you see that they stand right now in terms of cohesion, and what do you think the shift needs to be for this kind of fundamental change to actually happen?
Can you repeat the second question?
So where does everybody stand right now in terms of the purpose of education and schooling and what we're measuring? And what do you think is going to be needed to get cohesion so that you can actually implement some kind of change like this? Because it seems like a big change, a big shift.
Who wants to start?
Have you ever read the EQAO Act that created EQAO? I would encourage everybody to look it up, and then look at and I'm only focusing on EQAO because that's where the money is now going, right? And this is what we're spending on. So let's find out what we're spending now and how we're spending it, and then look at EQAO's own talk about what its mission is. What you'll find in the EQAO Act, at least the way I read it, is there's nothing in there about individual student results. And if you go back to the report for the love of learning, which led to the EQAO, it wasn't about individual student results either. That was all about public confidence, and that was a very different time. So I guess, I just kind of sometimes wish we could go back and talk about some of those fundamental assumptions, and you can see how we got here, right? There's a crisis, there's a perception of a crisis in public confidence. You create EQAO, they create what is sort of the simplest model of a standardized test, right? And roll it out everywhere, and almost 20 years later, we've made it a little shorter. So they're starting to think about going online and so forth, but it's still mostly the same model with the same expectations about what kinds of reporting would be meaningful and so forth. And we're in such a different time. How can we still be spending that kind of money to meet a need that I guess I'm not sure is still there? But
it wasn't a need even then.
Yeah, well, benefit of the doubt.
I think the way Richard Elmore presents it, and I think he's usually very pessimistic, but when he's talking about his efforts to support schools, he says that they are mostly palliative care for a dying institution. If we think about the challenges that were presented at the Connecting the Dots session, And if we honestly ask ourselves, are our kids prepared to deal with those massive issues that are threatening our existence as humanity, the existence of the planet, the sustainability? Are we doing that? And I think the honest response would be no. I think we're doing very well in some things, but our kids are not leaving the schools prepared to deal with a world that will be very difficult. Increased income inequality, increased orthodoxies, fundamentalism, violence, environmental degradation, etc. I don't think doing business as usual and just getting a little bit better in how we teach will create that capacity. So in that sense, I think we need to radically rethink what we're educating for and how we're doing it. And that will require a massive learning process for everybody, not only for the students, but for adults as well. I think Ontario has very strong foundations. It is one of the highest performing countries in the world, one of the highest performing public education systems in the world. It has a very strong teaching profession. It has a fantastic kind of future-oriented ministry that is focusing way more on support than on pressure. So I think the foundations are there, but what we will need to do and the way we will need to think about the measures and use them will have to be radically redefined.
I just wanted to say one thing. I'm not going to say it very well, but I think that one of the things, we're looking for fundamental change, but I think fundamental change can take a long time or short time. It depends on kind of what else happens in the world that you can't anticipate. But I think that one of the things that we can do is we can circulate the various stories of the outcomes and the effects of our current system. In terms, I'm going to talk testing, like some of the just like I've tried to do, but I tried to but there's lots out there, and circulate them and create opportunities for that exchange. And I rarely look to the USA for guidance in how we might deal with public education policy change. But in having said that, you're starting to see a lot of stuff happening with the parents and students and teachers flat out refusing to take the tests. I was listening to an interesting podcast called Hands Up, Don't Test, and it was about it was a link. The speaker who was a teacher, and he was saying lots of references to lots of studies I can't quite remember right now, but basically saying, I think it was in Colorado, an entire high school, flat out, for the seniors said, we're not taking the test. And he's some places try to penalize an individual student. Well, you can fail, but when nobody took the test, well, I didn't fail the entire senior class. You see in New York State, the opt-out, and other places, the parents are doing the opt-out movement. You're seeing a lot of activism around people refusing to take the test. I think that people need to know in Ontario that your child doesn't have to take the EQAO test. Sometimes parents say, yes, they do, they have to. I'm like, well, my kid didn't, and guess what? There was zero consequence. In fact, he ended up helping the other kids with the computer stuff because they were testing, piloting the computer to help them take the tests. And the teachers say, yeah, you know what, it's amazing. A lot of families go on vacation during the trip. I didn't know that. So maybe we could just sort of start sharing stories so we have some advantage. That won't radically change the whole testing culture that we're in globally, but I think we can do more through the exchange of stories about what the outcomes and effects and what other people are doing as part of their efforts for change.
I would suggest also to think about how can we use the force of the public for a for rather than against agenda, and I think that's going to be an important thing as well. I think there's some merit to opt out, especially in cases where standardized testing has had such a devastating effect on public schooling, and I'm talking about the United States. I don't think we're near there in Ontario yet. But at the same time, I think part of the struggle will be how can we use people's power for a for agenda, what we're moving towards. And I think we can have students as fantastic allies. The kind of things we are seeing, kids who develop a detector of lightning to prevent death by lightning on the beaches of their community, or developing the sustainable cell phone. Or we are yet to know what kids are capable of. We really are yet to know. We're just starting to explore the very surface of what kids are able to learn and to do. So if we start shifting dramatically what we're doing with them when we're engaging with them in schools, we can start creating them an alliance that can be very powerful. But again, I think what will create cohesion, Shafi, back to your question, is a clear, increasingly clear definition of what does it look like to be a student that's getting ready to go into the world to help solve these massive challenges we have behind us. What does it look like? And what practices produce that? The more precise we're around that, and the more we develop a shared definition of those issues, I think we're going to create what we need, the systems we need to radically shape what we're going to do in school.
Okay, I have the gentleman in the brown blazer, and okay, and then the woman in black, woman in blue, gentleman in check shirt, and then David. And I think that's probably all we have time for.
Okay. Well, just drawing attention back to the question of opportunity to learn, because we are talking about measuring what matters. And I think the question, in the other group team too, I did ask that question about exposure to opportunities to learn, exposure to the things that matter. Because if you're going to be measuring what matters, you have to be able to expose kids to things that matter. Who is exposed, who is not exposed. Mm-hmm. I have had a story of a school where every classroom, for example, I'm not saying that this is what matters, every classroom has a smart board. But I know another school, bigger, many more students, about 2 times the same number of students, that is just one smart board. And a teacher has to move them, one teacher has to sign off 2 weeks ahead to be able to move them and stuff like that. So how are we going to balance that, the tension of, actually exposing kids to the things that matter, what kind of circumstances, and what really, given also the way we design curriculum and teacher education, are teachers being prepared to be able to deal with these things that we call the things that matter. In fact, is school necessary for those things that we think that matter?
Anybody want to take that?
The answer to is school necessary, not necessarily. Given how information is flowing and how you can learn almost whatever you want to learn with YouTube videos, etc., at your own pace, whenever you want, etc. The key question is, what's the new role of schools? And I think they do have a new role, which is support kids so that they develop the skill to differentiate what's good information from not, what's information that you can trust versus not, etc. But it's very different. It's not about teaching them facts or information, etc. It's about helping them navigate. But exposure, I totally agree with you. I think it's constant exposure to the new behaviors we want to develop in kids is the best way to produce the new behaviors. And there's fantastic evidence, research evidence around that.
Okay, apparently we have 5 minutes, so we're going to power our way through.
I want to go back to the gentleman's comment about the purpose of public education. And then you connect that back to Dr. Charles' comment about the evolution of EQAO. And what educators have brought to the table is actually educators found that EQ serving that purpose might serve that purpose, but fell short of what public education is about. It's actually started from professional teachers and principals realizing that and questioning the value of EQAO up to a point. Because we all know that what we measure matters, and it's the tail that wags the dog. It's actually started with EQAO that caused teachers to narrow learning in the classroom. So now the conversation reversed, and so what the challenge is not what teachers should do. The challenge is actually to researchers and psychometricians to come up with better measurements of success and growth that reflects what public education is about. OECD has gone there. EQ is beginning to go there, especially with technology. Technology can now use digital footprints to measure, for example, collaboration. How you use search on the internet to make decisions and solve problems. Time on task, you see the OECD latest document, although Canada may not participate in the questions and the surveys about computer, but the students work on problem solving in reading and mathematics and digital footprints show that we are superior in teaching problem solving compared to, say, Shanghai, where those digital footprints show kids are at stages in the internet that's nothing to do with the problem solving and got distracted. There's time on task on kids. So it is actually not a challenge to educators, but a challenge to psychometricians to come up with measurements of assessment of success and how students learn right now and into the future that make them successful in the future. So to me, your question about public education and the role of academicians and researchers is more important than really because educators are crying for a different form of measurement.
Can I just ask my question because it speaks directly to that?
Okay. Okay. And then
based on what we heard this afternoon, are there conversations or any dialogue with EQAO about changing what really matters? I'm from an early years center working there, so we've got the early development instrument. We've got all sorts of wonderful stuff. It's about time that we have that's all taken into consideration and really pushing for really measuring what is important. And what role can school council, for example, like I see that as a driving force in really starting that dialogue if it hasn't started.
Well, I think you probably know David Cameron and the other folks at People for Education. I mean, that they're actually making way more progress getting EQA to talk about these things than we academicians. So kudos to them. Yeah, I'd take that up with them. I think they're really leading this.
I was just curious, just my name, kind of name people in front of me in mind. I'm wondering about your two discussions of the three of you. Namely, so you talked a lot about the consequential effects of the potential misuse of these whole population assessment fields and standardized testing. And you guys talked about different forms of measurement. One highly practical, in the form of evaluative developmental evaluation, practical measurement in the sense that you're using assessment and collaboration and interesting ways to build precision. But you're talking about the different ways you could get at what Jen Lane is talking about, which is rich depth in terms of the kinds of standardized assessments you're working from if you rethink what you're doing from whole population of these different kinds of groupings. And I'm wondering if you had a dislocated measurement system so that you did both, you did really interesting, deep, representative sample assessment environment where you said, we have these kinds of things, our kids can do these kinds of things in creativity well, and they're struggling with these kinds of things in creativity. And then you let the practical applied measurement and assessment of local schools and school boards worry it in a collaborative inquiry, like, what does that mean and how does that mean? I wonder if you could speak about kind of mixed modeled environments and how that might play out or not.
We're going to let you...
Good.
That's so huge. Dave, don't make us even try.
Okay, and with that...
Can we hear from somebody else?
I think last question goes to the
Okay, just a brief comment that when we're trying to address these kinds of issues, and as Winton described it, the rest of a black box of what goes on inside the school and so on, and we have parent advocates, we have researchers, academics, and so on. I feel that there's a major voice which is missing a lot of these discussions, and that's teachers. That we're the folks who spend decades of our lives, most of the time within decades of our lives, hammering away at these kinds of issues, and a lot of it's kind of triangulating and conjecturing around like what these folks, if you asked them and brought them in, would be able to provide some insight. And I really enjoyed this conference a lot today, but I will make one observation that of the 30 or so panelists, not one of them include their bio that they're a classroom teacher.
So can I just say one small thing on follow-up to that? So my area is not K-12. My area is post-secondary. And we're doing a lot of work on both formative and summative assessment in post-secondary right now. And the people who are actually doing that work is faculty. And that's a really interesting process because when you work with one faculty at a time, it takes a really long time. But it's organic, and when it sticks, it sticks, right? So it's a different model, and maybe if the two sectors talk to each other a little bit more, there could be more of a conversation about that. That would be nice. So I'm just going to leave it off. But thank you so much to our speakers.